Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Guildhall. I'm Andrea Grover, the Executive Director. The Hamptons Institute was started about 9 years ago by our former chairman, Mickey Strauss, and it was really a way for us to use this platform of our theater as a space for discussion of contemporary issues that are most pressing of our time. And that really connects to our founding mission as an institution. If you look over the front door of Guildhall, you'll see in gold letters that Guildhall, I'm paraphrasing, was founded as a gathering place for the community where the arts would encourage a finer type of citizenship. So this very much relates to this idea that participation in the arts actually increases our humanity, and that's very much the subject of this evening's program. So the Organizacion Latino-Americana, which is directed by Minerva Perez, really helped us put this program together. That institution promotes social, economic, educational, and cultural development for the Latino and Hispanic communities of the East End. Joining Minerva today from OLA is Sandra Dunn, who is their Associate Director. We also have Carlo Albán, who is an actor. April Gornik, who's an artist and an activist and community organizer, will be our moderator, and Carlo Sandoval, who is a filmmaker, will be joining them. But before we start, I wanted to say a few thank yous to our lead sponsors, the Hayden Family Foundation, to Susan and Steve Jacobson, to Joyce Menschel, Alice Netter, and Layla Strauss, and also for additional support from Carol Liebenson and Citarella. Also, tonight's program is being live broadcast by LTV, live streamed, so thank you for that. The producer of the Hamptons Institute series is Tracy Marshall, who's been with the program since its inauguration. We've also had an advisor in Sheraton, Kalouria, so thank you for that. Before we bring out our panelists, we're going to watch a clip from Carlos Sandoval's new film, which is entitled Bad Hombres. Thank you.
My father was gunned down by Bakersfield PD. 73-year-old suffering from dementia, early stages of dementia. He probably wasn't even doing anything, just taking his walk so he can try to rest. I ain't got nothing against the police, but this needs to stop against innocent people. Enough is enough already.
Look at your hand! Look at your hand! We have a 311 shots fired! Shots fired!
Ruben! Policia! Manos!
Oh, no?
Manos!
Hey.
Drop the gun! Drop the gun! Do it now! Drop the gun!
Luis, are you okay? You all 5 men! 5 men! Papa! Is he okay? He doesn't move!
Ven para acá. Va, ven acá. Ma!
Colonialization, racial dominance, the notion that there is a superior race in the United States has everything to do with control of a particular population.
When it comes to the criminal justice system, Latino stereotypes tend to focus on certain types of criminality. And these are long-standing historical narratives that have been created since at least the mid-1800s. Mexicans, Latin Americans generally, were looked at as an inferior race. That helped justify the conquest of half of Mexico by 1848. It certainly was part of what the United States designs on expanding westward. We're all about.
When the U.S.-Mexican War ended in 1848 and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, one of the key provisions was that Mexicans living on now United States side would be able to choose U.S. citizenship if they wished, and then to have their property rights maintained. But no matter what the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo said, many whites believed that they had won the war and Mexicans no longer had any claim or right to California. So they felt completely justified in posting notices that said all Mexicans, all Latinos, Chileans, Peruvians, any other Spanish speakers in the mines have 24 hours to leave, and if they didn't, they would be killed.
Anglo-Americans wanted access to Mexicans and indigenous peoples' land, and one of the principal ways to do that was to eliminate them, either by outright killings or by criminalizing them and making them outsiders in a community that they had long before actually dominated.
In the middle of the 19th century, Mexicans who were extra-legally killed by lynch mobs or Texas Rangers or vigilantes, it's certainly in the thousands. One of the things that led to the Mexican lynchings being forgotten is that they divided the victims into just two categories, black and white. And in that white category were Native Americans, Chinese, and more than anyone else, Mexicans.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. You've just seen a clip from Bad Hombres, the latest film by award-winning documentarian Carlo Sandoval. We're thrilled to have such an accomplished panel tonight joining us for this conversation. We want to thank you all for being here, and also special thanks to Anna Kessler for providing simultaneous translation. Before introducing everybody, I want to say first that, just a note about the other. Like using a telescope or a microscope, filmmaking and acting and art and music and literature and poetry also let us see beyond ourselves and our limits. Makers, like our panelists, help us cross boundaries when we experience their creative self-expression. These practices link people, giving us a glimpse of both what's outside and inside ourselves, by which we can then see ourselves more clearly. Immigration and identity is not a new hot-button issue. It's a very, very old one, and so is art and aesthetics. Tonight, we'd like to hear from our panelists about not only their passion about inclusion and responsibility and literal borders, but especially about the way that their creative expression allows conversation, promotes connectivity and transformation to take place. So, to my right is Carlo Sandoval. He's an Emmy-nominated filmmaker whose work includes the award-winning nationally broadcast documentaries, The State of Arizona, A Class Apart, and Farmingville. Carlos is on the faculty at the Columbia School of Journalism and is an advisor to several independent media organizations. A sometimes lawyer, Carlos writes a monthly column for the East Hampton Press, and he's currently at work on a family memoir spanning over 11 generations in what is now the United States. Sandra Dunn, the next panelist, is the Associate Director of Hola Vista in Long Island, where she focuses on advocacy, communications, and fundraising, where she managed the local immigration and civic engagement grant-making programs, also at the Hagedorn Foundation. For 13 years, she facilitated Spanish language memoir writing workshops through Her Story Writers Workshop and co-edited and co-translated Latinas Write, Escriben, in 2011. A bilingual anthology of memoirs in progress written by women in Her Story's Spanish language workshops. In 2013, she was appointed to the New York State Advisory Council of the United States Commission on Civil Rights and is the 2013 recipient of the Lawrence A. Timpa Memorial Award for Professional Service, awarded by the Suffolk County Human Rights Commission. In 2007, she was OLA's part-time executive director and resigned to run for a seat on the Southampton Town Council that year. Sandra holds a PhD in Spanish literature from Cornell University and has taught at Bennington College, Middlebury College, and Cornell. She lives in Hampton Bays, New York, and is working on a poetry collection about borders, thresholds, and other liminal spaces. Carlo, Albán, starred opposite Mark Wahlberg in the STX feature Mile 22, which was directed by Peter Berg. Some other feature credits include Margaret, which was directed by Kenneth Lonergan, Whip It, directed by Drew Barrymore, and 21 Grams by Alejandro González Iñárritu. On television, he has appeared in shows ranging from Sesame Street to Prison Break. That's quite a wide range. Carlo has extensive and impressive theater credits, is a member of the Labyrinth Theater Company, and most recently originated the role of Oscar in Lynn Nottage's Pulitzer Prize-winning play Sweat, for which he received a 2017 Theater World Award for Outstanding Broadway Debut. Most impressive. Minerva Perez is the executive director of OLA of Eastern Long Island, Organizacion Latino-Americana, where her work is focused on the protection, empowerment, and celebration of our Latino community. Through advocacy, education, and arts, OLA is helping to encourage policy and practice at a local level that seeks to integrate communities while also recognizing the vulnerability present in immigrant communities. While OLA continues to explore the ways theater, poetry, and music inform and shape our local understanding of the Latino culture in our midst, we are focused also with advocacy work relating to existing and growing exploitation of Latinos in the workforce, the housing crises, challenges regarding the integration of Latino parents into the framework of public education, and the challenges around building communication with local law enforcement. Prior to joining OLA, she worked for 6 years as Director of Residential and Transitional Services at The Retreat, where she ran a 24-hour crisis shelter for women and children fleeing domestic abuse. Many aspects of this type of advocacy work and municipal involvement have formed her understanding of the critical nature of relationship building and communication between victims, witnesses, and local law enforcement. As an East End advocate, Minerva has found the best way forward for our community as a whole is through informed action, collaboration, and willingness to not accept the lowest bar when it comes to human dignity and the protection of peaceful communities. So besides, to start the panel, and I want to encourage everyone to write down questions, because we'll be taking questions a little later. Besides Carlos's film clip, we're also going to have a poem from Sandra later, and a mini performance from Carlo, from something that he wrote. We'll talk about that a little more later. But I'd like to ask the first question to Carlo Sandoval. Much greater interest in documentaries on the part of the public, and congratulations on your Emmy, it's phenomenal, has occurred in recent years. But how did you decide to write your memoir? I'm really curious. It sounds like it's an homage to family and identity specifically. I was very compelled at this idea of the 11 generations that you were tackling. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how that relates to your documentary work?
Sure. Gracias, April. To begin with, Abril, I'll call you.
Oh, please.
Y bienvenidos. Muchísimas gracias. I feel like I'm being held accountable and to be very honest in terms of this family memoir, because it's something I'm just embarking on. It's something that I really wanted to start on all the way from college. It was supposed to be a sort of thesis, but I never quite grasped how to maybe unify it. And I think that my own journey is now really, I think, going to be reflected in this memoir, which traces my father's family, which is originally from New Mexico. Starting about 1580, they came in with the first Oñate expedition, but goes back further even in terms of our indigenous roots there. On my mother's side of the family, they're Puerto Rican. So in essence, I combine two people that are part of the United States now. We never crossed the border crossed us, which is a frequently cited position. And it really, I think, I hope it will be an exploration of identity, because identity, I think, is really at the core of much of my experience here. And identity, I think, in terms of our Latino community, is something that is being formed now, particularly in a place like East Hampton, where by now we have a generation of Latino and Latinas who have gone forth into the world. I personally know, I write a column for the East Hampton Press, and interviewed friends and focused on one young woman who graduated this past year from a local high school, and her sister had graduated before and is now working as a studio exec out in California. So in many ways, that the Latinos have been here for a while now, but that identity within our community is still being established. It is fluid. And I think how that is perceived, how it's received, is I hope going to be part of our conversation tonight, because that identity will very much be formed by how the larger East Hampton community responds to everyone who is here. And I think it's incumbent upon us, particularly in these times, to examine ourselves and how we want to posit that identity, how we want that experience to be, how we want it to be reflected, because it's under assault in so many ways. So I'll leave it there.
Well, having the opportunity to write about this, having it take form as a work of art, as a book, as literature, that is like a whole other focus. And would any other panelists like to comment on, in your work, how family and identity and shared history has impacted what you do? Anyone?
Sure, I'll jump in. My mother is an immigrant from Spain. My father is from a small town in North Carolina. And then there's me, the product of that. I think that, you know, everybody has a story, right? Everyone has something that they can turn into literature. And an organization that I worked with for a number of years as a facilitator, Her Story Writers Workshop, is an organization based here on the East End, founded by Erica Duncan over 2 decades ago, to allow all kinds of people from all walks of life to have a voice and to share their stories. And so I also have, as part of my training to be a facilitator, began my own memoir many years ago in 2004, picked it up again a couple of years ago, and keep plugging away at it. For me, what is most important, however, is not so much my own story, but the stories that spaces like writing workshops, and Her Story in particularly, allow for people who would normally be marginalized or feel themselves to not have access to a space that encourages their own story, their own voice, and that development in literary form. So it's not just a question of, journal writing or just write whatever's on your mind. It's a question of really shaping somebody's story into a work of art. And then once it is shaped into that work of art, or when it's in the process of being shaped, then that story can be used, and in particular I'm thinking of immigrant stories and the stories of the Latinas whom I've worked with. Those stories can be used to change hearts, change minds, change policy.
Well, that's so interesting, because when I was reading about you and thinking about liminal spaces, I came up with this question, which I think goes perfectly with what you're saying. And then I want you to read your poem, but tell me more about liminal spaces. I mean, how you define them, and have they become such a critical part of your work? Because I think of liminal space as a place where an artist or a poet and their viewer or a reader meet each other. Like, it's a safe space. Art and expression become safe spaces. The things that we all do as artists and filmmakers and poets and organizers and actors is we create a safe space that people can experience for the general public, trauma, grief, things that we all share, joy, but for there being two cultures that come together, perhaps not easily, you know, when there are immigration and identity problems and crises, then that also takes on another role, an extra role of safety that can allow for healing and for connection. And I mean, although liminal spaces I think of as being sort of by definition a metaphysical situation, it's also congregational, transformational.
Right.
So and her story sounds like a perfect vehicle for that. And in your own personal work?
Right. I think her story is a vehicle for that. I think Ola is a vehicle for that in our emphasis on the arts, and Minerva will talk about this in a moment. But, you know, the arts being a place where people can come together and have the same experience, even though we might receive Carlos's film or any film, for example, in different ways, we are still having the same collective experience, and that is so incredibly important to break down those walls and barriers. So we can also think of a liminal space as artists and activists, right? Art and activism, and how do we bring those two realms together? And I would say in my own work, having been an activist in one form or another for many, many years, and specifically in the area of immigration and immigrant rights, art is also a place where you can just let it all be there, right? And again, that doesn't mean your art is just, you know, words and words and words, in my case, spilling out, and no shape or no form or no artistry. You might start there, but then you shape and you form and you turn it into something. But art is that space, for me anyway, where my activism can be there. So I might do my work for Ola day to day, and I think of it kind of like what doctors and nurses must have to do to be able to go into hospitals every day and deal with people who are suffering or in horrible pain, that you have to have some kind of veil or shield so you can do your work and protect yourself, and so you're not crying all the time. And so in our work that we do when we're dealing with vulnerable communities, there's that as well, that you are dealing with people who are in such difficult situations, and we're dealing in this country right now with such a broad, difficult situation because of bad immigration policy that is nothing new, by the way, that we need art as a space to allow that channel, to create a channel for not just emotions, but how to package things so that a broader public can feel and can empathize with what immigrants might be going through, and understand things in a deeper and more heartfelt way. For me, anyway, that's what it is. And then, you know, liminal spaces, you mentioned metaphysical, but then I think of physical spaces such as physical, literal borders. And we see, you know, in Carlo's film, the map, that is fascinating and always has been to me, is who gets to decide where those borders are? What happens on a border? Who does that border belong to? And who decides who that space belongs to and what happens there? So that's just one example.
Would you like to read your poem now?
Sure. I don't know, the short one or the long one?
Go for it.
What are you in the mood for out there?
Let's have an impulse decision.
Okay.
And is this an example of a liminally inspired piece?
It is, because it deals with some activity happening on the border right now and for many years. For me, anyway, the way I understand liminal spaces or thresholds, you know, it can be the threshold between this auditorium and the lobby, for example. You know, the space of that door frame or a windowsill, or also some things like borders and cages, who is inside, who is outside, who decides who is where. So those are the kinds of ideas I'm trying to work with in my poetry. This poem I'd like to read, it's called in English, The Icebox or The Cooler, in Spanish, La Hielera. In 2014, many Central American so-called unaccompanied minors started coming up, crossing the borders by themselves, or at least without an adult that they were close to, often without an adult family member. And these kids were coming from the so-called Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And because of a certain law, they were allowed to come in, unlike Mexican kids who were turned away at the border and had to go back to Mexico. The kids from the Northern Triangle countries were allowed to come in, but then had to go through their court processes in family court and in immigration court. So when I was a funder at the Hagedorn Foundation, we were funding organizations to provide free legal services to these kids. So this is a reality that continues to happen at the border. And another thing I would just like to say is that what is happening at the border is absolutely connected to what happens here where we live on the South Fork. Because those families are our families, are the families that are a part of our community. So it's not that what's happening at the border is disconnected at all. It's real and it's here. And when I say the kids coming over, they were as young as 1.5, and then up through the teenage years. And I visited a place on Long Island where the children are temporarily kept, and this one boy inspired me to write this. La Hielera. Your black spiked mohawk and fierce brown eyes disguise fears of things seen and unseen. Adolescence held hostage at the border, swift adios to innocence, when childhood's end begins in liminal spaces. Train, truck, raft, rails, road, river. Your stumble and trudge onto sands, torched and arid, your young skin assaulted by sun's tortured scorch, your clothes wet and poor that you once again don for the forward march to a chance. Unleashed in these badlands, you don't bring a dream, but a whimper, a cry, for a hint of compassion and a place to call home. You turn yourself in, manhandled with indifference, agents rolling their eyes at yet another child alone or child with a child. Younger sister or brother, same bleak story told. Plot unfolding with every step of their cold rig process. Assembly line for kids who've crossed alone or with smaller others, forced to play leader in this treacherous trek. Inhospitable cell you label La Hielera, congelada compañera que te espera a este lado de la frontera de cristal. The icebox, freezing cold companion that awaits you on this side of the glass border. Cold communal limbo, infinite shiver and sit. Locked in the icebox, you wait your turn at the leap of faith to alien airspace, crawling with lawyers and others, steering you there and here, life as you know it undone in an instant. Calamitous crossing, portals unimaginable from your perch inside what you once knew as home, beside your sister and mother, tortillas, rice and beans, staples you thought were forever and everywhere food of the gods, until you're released into the heartland of golden arches and Burger Kings, royals you'll soon learn exact a different tax and sacrifice. Heartland, La Hielera de America, where erosion of family and notions of home receive you with frigid embrace, sprung from one cold case to another, You tremble and shake. You stake your brave claim in this land of the free. Await your next court date. Interminable shuffle between timorous and bold. Black mohawk, stiff bristled, yet soft. Fierce eyes that hold history not to be told.
That's a beautiful poem. It's, you did some visceral things with that poem that I thought were extraordinary. I mean, besides the bristle of his hair, which I almost felt like I was touching, you also made us very cold for a few minutes as you were reading it. It had real temperature changes that were really beautiful. I mean, you gave us a real experience. And that's what I think, again, that's like an example of art making a safe space to experience something that's actually terrifying. Without that, I think we'd all be overwhelmed somewhat by the news and the stories and everything that, well, I mean, we all are on the edge of being overwhelmed every day. But, I mean, art is so healing that way. Would anybody else like to talk to this subject? Or give a reaction? I just thought that was beautiful.
I mean, I had a lot of thoughts while both of you were speaking, but particularly Sandra, I was thinking about her story and your comment that sharing our stories can change hearts and can heal hearts, and that's something that I also believe and have come to learn. And art saved my life. It really, really did. Something that was not included in the bio is that I'm an immigrant as well. I'm an immigrant. I was not born here. I was born in Ecuador, and I came to this country on a tourist visa with my parents when I was a child, and then we stayed. And we were undocumented for 12 years. And
were you scared most of the time, or did you think about it? Or were you too little to have a sense of that?
I wasn't scared most of the time, but there were definitely moments when there was a lot of fear, and when the situation became kind of untenable for me as a child. But for the most part, I was a kid. It was really my parents that were kind of dealing with it and that had the responsibility. But I feel like I didn't really start to understand the impact that it really, really had on me, psychologically, spiritually, until I became an artist, and until I started to process those things, I feel, as an adult, and started to tackle them, and started to actually let myself open up, and kind of feel those wounds, and really, really start to understand what they did to me. And now I see it as my job to share that, and I think part of sharing that is sharing my story and sharing our stories. And I think that, I don't know why I often think, why me? Like, why have I had the opportunities that I have had? Because I'm just like any one of those kids. I was just like any one of those kids that are going through those terrible traumas at the border right now. That could have been me. Those kids whose parents got, taken away in the raids in Mississippi, that could have been me. That was my worst nightmare when I was a child. And it's happening right now. It's happening. And so we as artists need to respond. I think you're absolutely right about that. Art can save lives, and stories can, I still believe, change hearts. I hope.
I think so too. I was saying to Carlos before we came out here that I'd recently watched his film, Farmingville, and I feel stupid that it took me so long to see it, because it's extraordinary. It's moving. It's unnerving, and it's absolutely relevant to today. It was made in 2004, and yet I felt like everything that I was watching was something that I needed to remind myself of or see or learn about right now. It was really so unbelievably contemporary, and art is known for its longevity. You want art to be eternal, but of course a documentary is very particular to a time. A story is very particular to a time, and what we're all going through is particular. But like I was saying at the beginning, art and arguments about aesthetics and what counts and what's important, and the identity that usually engenders those kinds of senses of possession and what's important and how you define it. It's culture, and it comes from a narrative. So narratives shared, though, to your point, narratives shared make all the difference. If you don't share your narratives from culture to culture, then you don't have that kind of accessibility. Your mind isn't opened, and you lose a wonderful opportunity for aesthetic experience, which is just so deeply yearned for, I think, by the human soul. I mean, I believe in that, but I'm a romantic. Not really. So I just thank you for sharing that. And then you were saying also that you had actually been a part of a series that really blew my mind that was in Radio Lab. It had been presented. It's a 3-part series called The Border, and I highly recommend that also. It's about the history, really, of immigration and immigration struggles in El Paso, Texas. And of all the places, to be in the news right now, but also the history of El Paso is not as you would expect. I mean, it has a very, 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 very long history of great community and peace, and the way that trouble started there had to do with bad laws, bad enactment of laws, and all sorts of misguided attempts to direct it in a certain way. So, I mean, you're making documentaries, Carlos, and they inform us and tell us a story. Poems your poem was very narrative. And Carlo, you've written a play. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I wrote a solo show years ago, which was, I mean, it was about my journey as an undocumented immigrant and my journey towards, getting my papers towards legalization, and of course around that, my family story and how we came here. Within that show, there's like a 5-minute segment where I talk about, because I started acting when I was still a kid. I started acting while I was still undocumented, and I was on Sesame Street. I was a series regular on Sesame Street for 5 years while I was undocumented. And so there's a small section of the show that kind of talks about that. But really the show is about, the play is really about the journey that I went through at that time towards legalization. And this was, we moved here in 1986. So, we got our green cards in 1998. So the country was very different. The laws were very different. The journey that I took at that time is impossible now. An immigrant child could not possibly do that today. Mm-hmm. They don't have those opportunities.
It's called Intrigulis?
Yes, the play was called Intríngulis, which is an obscure Spanish word, which means a complex web or an ulterior motive. And there was music in the play. There was a lot of Latin American folk protest music, and I took that word out of a Victor Jara song. Victor Jara was a Chilean singer-songwriter who was murdered by Augusto Pinochet in the coup d'etat on September 11th, 1973. So that word came out of a song from a Victor Jara song, which was in the show. Would you like to hear?
I would. I don't know how better to ask.
So this is This is about a 5-minute segment of that show, of Intríngulis. Each little segment had its own little title, so this one is called Tales from the Street. Pop quiz. Don't worry, it's multiple choice. As a teenager, I was A, in high school, B, an undocumented immigrant, C, a regular cast member of Sesame Street, or D, all of the above. And you already know the answer. D, all of the above. So I was hiding in plain sight, pretending to be an all-American teenager while playing one on television. Let's rewind a little bit. I fell into acting at the age of 11 when we accompanied my cousin to an audition for the musical Oliver in Union City, New Jersey. I tried out on a whim. My brother ended up getting cast as one of Fagin's boys, and I ended up getting cast as Oliver. My first words on the stage appropriately being, "Please, sir, I want some more." From there, I ventured on to other projects, eventually auditioning for and landing a role on Sesame Street. Nobody on the show had any idea about our legal status, and I had to use counterfeit documents every time I had to fill out paperwork, which was often. It seems illogical that my parents would allow me to put myself out there in that way, but if you think about it, what better place to hide than in the spotlight where no one would suspect you? And if you think about it some more, we moved here for opportunity, as most everyone does. And when opportunity knocked, my parents didn't have the heart to tell me no. One night, before Thanksgiving, I hit my father. I threw a fit because he had failed to change the date on my counterfeit green card. See, when we had purchased it years before, whoever made mine put the wrong birth date on it. And this is not something that you can return. There's no money-back guarantee on counterfeit documents. I needed to fill out paperwork to be in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. I was going to ride on the Sesame Street float and sing the song and do the dance in Herald Square before an adoring television audience. It was all set, except that Macy's, the employer, needed proof that I was allowed to work. And for that, I needed my counterfeit green card, the only illegal document I had that proved that I was legally allowed to work. But it had the wrong birth date on it, and I was convinced that my other employer, Sesame Street, was going to notice that date and say, "Wait a second, what's going on here? You weren't born on the 4th of July, you were born in October. We celebrated your birthday just last month in Hooper Store while you were chopping onions during the Why is Carlo Crying segment. Somebody call immigration." I was terrified. So I had instructed my father to change the date on the Xerox machine at his office, assuming, of course, that my father had the forging skills of James Bond. But my father was not an international spy or a movie star. He was a cheesemonger. He sold cheese. So he didn't change the date. And I flipped out. I kicked over a chair, I flipped a couch, and I hit my father. I punched him in the chest. He placed his hands on my shoulders to try to calm me down, and I grabbed him by the throat and accused him of trying to choke me. It was very melodramatic. It runs in my family. My mother ran out of the living room crying. I was crying. The cat was crying for food, I think. My father might have cried, but it must have been later because I never saw it. It must have been in private because I never saw it. The next day, he drove me into the city at the crack of dawn, and he waited while I rode on that damn float and waved to the people lining the streets of Manhattan. Hundreds of thousands of people. And they all waved back and smiled as if I was one of them, as if I belonged. But I was still undocumented, and it still felt awful, and still no one knew. And one day in history class, the teacher decided to give us all a lesson in civic responsibility, so she handed out voter registration forms, because we were all going to be adults soon. I didn't want any trouble, so I passed the whole pile back without taking one. And while everyone else filled out their forms, I looked down at the lewd etchings on my desk. But the teacher saw me and asked if I was going to fill out a form. And I thought to myself, you know what, screw it. And I said, no. I'm not going to fill out a form because I am not a citizen. And she said, okay. And she went back to her work. But the student sitting across from me looked up at me and said, "You're not a citizen? Then get out of my country." So I grabbed my history textbook and I bashed him over the head repeatedly, and nobody did anything to stop it because they knew that I was justified in doing so. Except I didn't really do that because I couldn't. And I didn't say a word because I couldn't. I simply sat in silence. The truth that I was not one of them, that I did not actually belong, made suddenly painfully clear. Around this time, I had a recurring nightmare. It would start out with me sitting in my apartment at 123 Sesame Street practicing counting. 1, 2, 3. When there's a knock at the door, I walk to the door with a cheery disposition and answer with a smile. On the other side of my smile, I see Oscar looking especially green and smelling especially dirty, flanked by Big Bird and Snuffy, and they're both looking especially gigantic and overbearing. Oscar asked me if there's anything I'd like to share with them. I answer that as much as I'm a big fan of sharing and helping and compromising, I don't have anything for them at the moment, but they're welcome to come hang out and count with me if they feel so inclined. Then Oscar gives a signal, and the giant bird and the hairy elephant tackle me to the ground and drag me out of the building, and outside an angry mob of children and Muppets and viewers like you are throwing styrofoam letters and numbers and chanting, "Why is Carlo crying?" Then, out of Hooper's store, somebody brings a bucket of hot dog, dumps it on my head, and douses me with a raft of yellow feathers. And just before I'm dumped into Oscar's trash can, which leads straight to the Immigration Department's detention center, the announcer says, "This program has been brought to you by the number 1 and by the letters USA."
Thank you so much. That was phenomenal. You know, I started to feel for a second the contrast between what you did and your poem, and yet they're both about little boys. And they're both from such different perspectives, and they're both expansive in their own way. And isn't that like just fantastic? Do you have a favorite role that you did? You've been in so many movies and TV shows and everything. I mean, you have a huge, huge amount of experience. For such a young man.
I have done a lot of things. I would say that lately, the best thing that I've done lately is Sweat, which was Lynn Nottage's play. And only because, you know, like through the years I've done a lot of things, but there's projects along the way that are just really personal. And that project, particularly the character that I was portraying, was a Latino in Pennsylvania, in Reading, Pennsylvania, and he's an American. The character was born in Reading, Pennsylvania, but the Latino community in that area is very much seen as outsiders, even though they're a huge part of the community. And so I just connected with that in such a strong way because I have a real sense of what it is like to be marginalized, or to feel marginalized, even if other people may not see you that way. And so, you know, and I also think that play is just extraordinary. I mean, it's a play about our country right now, and it's just gorgeous.
It seems like everybody's doing a little better in film and television and the media at really trying to have real representation of all the people that make up this country, instead of there being these typecasting situations. Certainly documentary films help to peel away all that stupid kind of archetyping that we do, or typing that we do, I should say. Minerva, hi. Let's talk about film and stagecraft and everything, because you've done a lot of acting as well, and you were responsible for bringing the vagina monologues here in Spanish, which I thought was brilliant, just a brilliant, brilliant thing to do. You want to talk about that a little bit? And did you feel that there were things that were specifically Latina about having had that experience in Spanish instead? I mean, I've certainly seen it in English, and I missed yours, but how did you think that impacted the community and you and your perception of it as a play?
Well, thanks for that interesting and difficult question. I think it's a great question. I think what was most wonderful to experience from doing that production was it was kind of art doing exactly what art should do, and especially that kind of art where you're focusing on violence against women and girls and just violence in families and whatnot, is that didn't have to really be a Latino or non-Latino thing. It had to be English or any other language. Any language you spoke, you can present those same stories that those monologues that Eve Ensler had written, and everyone understands those experiences, or someone that they know has had that experience, or it's very close to them. I think what was exciting about doing it was being told by longstanding members of our East End community that there's no way in the world Latinos are coming to see the vagina monologues in Spanish. And I said, well, that's exactly why we're going to do it, because we put together this great cast of, I think, about 16 members of the community and actors, some not yet actors, which is great, and that's the whole reason for Eve Ensler's production. And we did it entirely in Spanish because it was also important to note that anyone kind of coming through those doors would have to be really, really comfortable to do so. And the tough balance to maintain or to be cognizant of when you're doing art or producing theater is that I had to make sure people understood this was for them, that it wasn't something that was in English, and oh, by the way, we're gonna interpret this for you, or translate this for you off to the side. It was going to be entirely in Spanish and have this be something that people could get by the title, which was gonna be difficult, and then also...
it wasn't that easy for English speakers when it first came out either. I know quite a few eyebrows that were raised as far as they could go when I heard about it.
So what we did is we got on Fiesta Radio, the only Spanish language radio station out here, and we talked a lot about it and the nature of the monologues and the reason why this was so important and for everyone to come. And then we had one night production of it, and I stood there watching a group of 4 25-year-old men come in, and I kind of looked like, is there someone behind them? But you know what? They wanted to be there. And then we had like little grandmas coming in as well. And again, I was like, wait, how is this happening? Sure enough, the whole place was packed. We had also, I should say, I kind of walked around areas of Southampton and handed out cards that said the vagina monologues, and then I said things like "Viva la vagina," and the men were like, "What is happening right here?" But I think that's maybe why they came. I don't know. I'm kidding. But telling those kinds of stories, sharing experiences that came through these monologues. How sad to not get to share that with a part of our population that is a very vibrant part of our East End. I mean, right now, I will say that it's a low number, but a low average is 45% of all of our student body on the East End, that's 20 plus districts, South and North Fork, are Latino student body. And then the families that go around with those kids. I mean, this is a huge part of our population, and these are our valedictorians, our salutatorians, these are our leaders in our community. One thing that I did want to mention, just I didn't want to lose it entirely, but this thread of sort of liminal space, or also sort of safe space and what art can do, is that this theater, that was one of the first places that I kind of found out when I first moved to the East End from Brooklyn, and before that from Miami, this was home. And why I'm thrilled to continue to work with Guildhall and work with Andrea and work with Joe and Jen, Sebastian, and everyone here, is that this represents that kind of safe space, a church-like space for me. I had a theater company in the city for a while. Theater was my background, actually. And I felt immediately, after I started doing more work with Ola, that this space, even though the doors are always open to everyone, right now especially, what can we do to make sure that the art that's happening here, the art that Ola either helps to produce, or just that we help to kind of cheer people on, that Guildhall is producing directly, to bring in audience members from all over this community. And an example of that is happening right now in this audience, that we have people here with a range of experiences that are all coming together in this space, this kind of hollowed ground of the John Drew Theater. To have this kind of conversation is something that can happen in a theater, but I don't know that can happen in other places, and which is why it's so important to have this dialogue. And I'm so happy to see everyone of all different backgrounds and experiences here. But these stories that you're hearing are, people are getting them from very different places. People that have experienced them themselves 3 months ago, and people that have only heard this on the news. People, we have a range of experiences in this space, and I feel it's very important to state how great Guildhall and what this means, because this is the safety that we need to have these kinds of conversations and break some of these fourth walls for you all, because we're all living here and experiencing this together. So I'm happy to be part of it.
I think that's being reflected in other cultural institutions out here too. I know Southampton Art Center, and I think that everybody's cluing in to the riches that we have here. Like, we just have not plumbed all the richness in this community, and a large part of that is our Latino community, and we really need to get it together and make things more accessible. I'm sure there's lots of Latino people who speak English, and there's enough of us that can speak Spanish and understand Spanish, that we can just be more entertained, more informed, more inspired by each other in these kinds of spaces. How do you, and as curator of the Latino Film Festival, how do you see that going forward too? I mean, film is such, witness Carlos's amazing work. I mean, how do you see film as being an integral part of that and the film festival? Because I think that more people should be attending that from the, Caucasian community, as it were, and the Black community, everybody.
Well, it's definitely, we're going to our 16th year, so November, I think it's 14, 15, and 16, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. We have been working with venues like Parish Museum, Guildhall, and we're going to be over in the North Fork and Greenport. And this film festival came about as a way to not only sort of bridge sort of a divide or just bring communities together, not just Latino and non-Latino, but Latino and Latino, so that you're sharing stories that might be coming out of Chile, let's say, or Jews in Chile. What is that experience like? There are going to be people that maybe didn't really know about that. Maybe they're from other countries that we have out here. So they're going to be learning something new about an experience that someone in the Jewish culture or Jewish community from Chile is their experience. So we really look at this as kind of this bridge building dynamic festival that every year we're bringing in films from all over. In fact, I will call out our amazing and she's doing simultaneous interpretation back there, Anna Kessler. Can we just give her a hand for a second? She works professionally for the court system in Riverhead. She herself is El Salvadoran, and she helped to connect us to a film from El Salvador that we showed last year and we also were able to bring in one actor from El Salvador to speak about the film afterward. And it was a film that was based on the Othello story. And so it wasn't necessarily what one might immediately think of when you think of your story from El Salvador. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to bring it. It was a very well-made film, and it just gave you another perspective on another story that's also happening in El Salvador. And so Anna had everything to do with connecting us to that film. But those kinds of stories, and it's important that we're constantly changing it up, that we're keeping the film festival open to brand new films, and also some films that might be a little bit more established but not necessarily shown or seen. And seeing them with an audience is a very different experience than watching them, as we know, on our phones and Hulu or wherever else. So film, I don't know if you want to talk about some other. I think April needs to be called out here for a second. Yeah. She's going to be mad at me.
No, but I love. I do think it's important that people have shared experience. It's like everybody. It's like hearing a story. It could be something that you hear from one person or many people in a room hearing from a stage, but just there being an ability to share narratives. It's extraordinary. And then talkbacks, working on the Sag Harbor Cinema, coming back and everything. watching people after movies are shown and seeing people discuss and seeing the questions that people raise is revelatory. I mean, people are way smarter than you think all the time. It's always impressive the way that people respond.
Can I just add that I think, April, you've really brought us back to narrative tonight, and I think that we've all talked about art and its transformational nature. And I think that now, in this time, having been around immigration issues for going on 2 decades through film, but also prior to that, one of the things that brought me into film was that I thought it could create that space where we could transform hearts, where we could get in at a different level than the usual policy stuff. And I think that what we're experiencing now really proves that even more, because there are competing narratives out there. And I think that more than ever, one of the ways that we can capture people is through story, is through personal experiences, is through that immediacy. And so I think this forum tonight, and being able to do a couple of things, I think. One is to explore art through activism, but also to bring us all to that space where we can share, and we can each, I think, reflect ourselves, not only through our Latino identity, which sometimes tends to be stereotyped, but also through our creative side. So I really, really appreciate what Ola has done in bringing all of us here today in this opportunity to talk about breaking down that fourth wall and narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just when you read your poem and then Carlo did his monologue, it was like a fantastic contrast, and it was dimensional. I mean, just having had those two gems of an experience each it was really riveting, and it's a gift. I mean, artists, like it or not, whether you prefer someone's aesthetic or not, art is like an extraordinary gift in any kind of culture and community. It needs to be nurtured, and it has its own longevity and its own really lasting impact. I think people just do not forget this kind of thing. It changes hearts and minds. We need to open this up to the audience. I think it's time to do that. But does anybody else on the panel want to talk about what kinds of art developments they think can be impactful in terms of knitting a community together, in terms of closing gaps that we all experience because of all different cultures here?
I would just like to share something that I experienced. This was in January 2017, so it was right after the inauguration. And a couple of poets out here, Catherine Levy and Julie Sheehan, organized something that I think was called Writers Resist, or it was part of something that was being organized across the country. And this took place at Southampton. I still call it Southampton College because my husband used to teach there at Stony Brook, Southampton. And it was a wonderful gathering of at least 100 people in the audience, and very participatory. And then there were a number of poets and writers, well-known East End poets and writers, who were participating, getting up and standing up there and sharing poems and thoughts and writing in reaction to this election and talking about the way forward. And I would just like to share that someone who I believe is in the audience tonight, Otilia Aguilar, who wrote with me for several years in a Her Story Writers Workshop, in one of the workshops that I did in Spanish for many years here on the South Fork. And she participated, and she wrote pages and pages and pages of a very moving piece in reaction to the election. And I worked with her to edit it down to, a manageable size for this kind of format that we had. And she read it in Spanish, I read it in English, and we heard so many comments that day that this was the most moving piece that was read. And I believe that it was the most moving piece that was read because Otilia spoke about her experience. She was trained as a nurse in Mexico, although she has been here many, many years, and was not always able to work as a nurse here, as you might imagine, but recently was able to do that in a local health clinic. And she was talking about her patients, and not just Latino patients, but had stories from a couple of Latino patients, but also an African-American patient. As she's checking his blood pressure, for example, he is saying, I don't know what I'm going to do now that this person has been elected president. My landlord is already trying to evict me and telling me that after all these years of living there, that I need to go. And this is a US citizen, an African-American man from the South Fork. And then there were similar stories that she was hearing from her patients who were really, really, really concerned about what now? I'm building a life here, I've been here for so long, I don't have status yet, but now I'm terrified that I will be deported. So she was seeing this, she was hearing these stories in the doctor's office, but also seeing in those instances and over time how this reality that is so insecure for so many people, not just immigrants. And when we say immigrants, we're not only talking about Latinos, of course. Not all immigrants are Latino, not all Latinos are immigrants. And, but she was seeing the health effects of this new reality that we are all living. So I think that making sure that all voices get heard, that all voices have access to a stage, have access to publication, I think that is a big part of the way forward. That it's not just reserved for a few, right? But that we open it up to all and try to unearth people's stories as much as possible and share their stories, not only to change hearts and minds, but also to share with each other if we are of similar mind. We need community. We need to be building strong, reliable, safe community for ourselves, for each other, and for future generations. And I do think that going that extra step to unearth stories and voices that we don't normally hear is the way forward.
Beautifully put. Questions?
I wanted to add something to that, only because we have the great, the good fortune of getting to work and have John Lopez, who is also in the audience with us. He's going into his second year, finishing his second year at Georgetown University. Sag Harbor native, proud Mexican-American, working with us full time, and because of his sort of presence with us, we've been able to do more work with Latino youth leadership. And I have to say, we've also just established a scholarship fund through a wonderful couple, and the kind of essays and the kind of responses we got back were so strong. And so these are 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds that are living out here in the East End. These range from East Hampton High School students all the way to Riverhead. Right now we're focusing on the South Fork. And these stories that focus in on identity, on how they're going to move forward, how they envision their future. Some of them documented, some of them undocumented. And those stories were so strong, those narratives, those voices are so strong. What we're going to make sure that Ola's doing is helping to also create a platform for some of those voices, whether that be through the arts, whether that be in other ways, oratorial ways, but making sure that those are going to be the folks that you're going to be seeing out there. And I am going to say, as a to urge you as an audience to be there for that, because these are going to be things that are going to be done in English and or Spanish. Maybe you're going to be the ones wearing the headset, but it's okay. They're comfortable and they work really well. But that's okay. And so, I want to encourage that the audiences that Ola is going to be asking for in the future are going to be featuring those voices, some of them sitting right here in this audience. And that's really exciting, because that is our future. That's not their future. It's not their future. It's our future, and we're going to be an organization that helps bring that forward. And there are exciting times in front of us all, exciting times. We're seeing ourselves through a crisis, although we are working right now with this crisis, but we are also seeing ourselves through that. We are not going to be identified only as survivors of a crisis. We are, all of us together, working to make this a healthier, a safer, and a vibrant community where we have access to the arts and we have access to the best of ourselves and the best of our own human dignity.
Well, it was... Yes, please. I was thinking, too, talking about Farmingville again for just a second, there's a position of invisibility for a documentary filmmaker sometimes. Not if you're Michael Moore. You are right out there. But the way that Farmingville was so brilliantly done by you and Catherine Tambini was I think that you were absolutely invisible when you made that film, and yet the film works into this whole reveal of a community, interactions, strife, struggle, resistance, kinds of really, really annoying behavior by some of the members of it. And yet at the end of it, there is a kind of a coming together. And for the viewer, there's a coming together of dimensionality of a community, which is really important. So like or hate some of the people that are involved in this documentary, you really start to feel that you have some grasp of like what the problems are, where you can go, how you would act. You're kind of inserting yourself, I think partly because of the way that you're invisible. So it's great to have autobiography and stories told, personal stories told, but it's also fantastic to have that kind of omniscient, invisible person putting something together. Can you talk about that for just a sec?
Well, it's interesting because in making Farmingville, one of our objectives was really to create a kind of neutral space, a space in which all voices could be heard, the goal being that we would all listen to each other. So withdrawing from that as much as possible, trying to let the story unfold without our presence was very important. At one point we thought of doing it through personal narrative and my perspective, but it didn't want to go there, which I fought for not having to go there. But I also want to say one thing, you talk about the end of it, and one of the things that you can do in making a documentary, as you can do in virtually any story, is you can make the end what you want the end to be. And we saw in Farmingville a community that was really at odds, that started out at a hyper intense level, became ground zero for the national immigration debate at that time, really in many ways launched where we are today. We saw what was going on there, take its show. We heard at the time it was going to go to Arizona, which it did, and it grew. But within the context of the film, we were able to show, a sort of towards the end, one of the final scenes was where the national hate groups were coming in to the small town of Farmingville. And in this VFW hall, which had previously, 2 years before, I remember walking into this local meeting, and the seething anger among all the residents that was there, the emotion that was at the surface, backed away. People did not show up for this day of truth. And that, to me, was the hopeful ending, the hopeful way in which to go. We crafted that ending. It was true to the story, but we crafted it. The same thing happened in many ways in the state of Arizona, where we saw that because people like the Chamber of Commerce felt that things were going too far with proposed immigration laws that were coming forth in the state, including SB 1070, which was the Show Me Your Papers law, laws that went beyond that. They were rejected by Arizona at that time. And that gave us the hopeful turn and outlook. What I can't tell now is where this story is going, this national story currently, because I don't know where it's going to go. And in many ways, it depends on all of us. But I feel that we're in that turmoil, that churn right now. And it's a process.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, this is just the perfect time for this question that just came up from the audience. And if someone wrote this and wants to embellish on it or whatever, please go ahead. It reads, is it time for art to encourage people to move out into the streets? Does art have a responsibility to nudge us out of zones of safety? Anybody want to talk about that?
Last fall, the Public Theater in New York City, which is a theater that produced Sweat at the Public and then on Broadway, Oscar Eustace, the artistic director, came up with this idea because of the election of Donald Trump and because of the subject matter of the play, to take the play to communities. So, theater, particularly in New York, can be very kind of exclusive and elitist. And a lot of people, myself included, can't afford to pay for a ticket to go see a play at the Public Theater or on Broadway. And you know, the Public Theater has this initiative called the Mobile Unit, where they take Shakespeare plays to communities that need them, particularly prisons and homeless shelters. He decided to take that model and use Sweat to take the play to the communities that were affected by the issues in the play, which were deindustrialization, people that had lost their factory jobs had been shipped overseas, communities that had been once very much thriving and then had broken apart, in the Rust Belt, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. So instead of, you know, doing his play at the Public Theater and expecting the community to come to him, we took the play to them. We took the play to, we did it in union halls, we did it in church halls, we did it in a Masonic temple at one point. We went to 18 cities in 30 days, and all of the performances were free. And members of the community, you know, the producing team reached out to members of the community and made sure to, you know, bring as many people as they could. And it was the most powerful experience that I've ever had.
It sounds electrifying.
And it was completely outside of the theater. It was a play, but it was not, we were not in traditional theater spaces. And it was, you know, A, because it was accessible, B, because we were welcoming the community, and then after every performance there was a conversation, there was a talk back. And that was actually the best part of the whole thing, is just sitting in these rooms, these communities that were very much fractured, seeing people of, you know, very diverse ethnic backgrounds coming together, people sitting in the room together and talking that normally would not do that. They just wouldn't. There is no place in their community where they would normally gather in this way and then experience something and have a conversation about it. And it was just, I mean, you know, it felt to me like the right model for what I think we need it nationally. I mean, we need that all over the country.
When I think about art providing a safe space, or a place like Guildhall providing a safe space for people to have experiences, I don't think that it means that it's not a place where you can't be absolutely turned upside down by the power of something, that rendered speechless by the emotion that's being expressed. I don't think that at all. I mean, to this question, I would say, do I have to choose? But certainly, I think that art inspires, and art has had an impact on politics to a certain extent. I think much less than legislation, but you know, that's a pretty hard ass measurement of the thing and impact. But what you did is just something that you wish everybody in America could experience, because I think that there are so many unexposed communities in America. And I'm not just talking about inner cities or wherever, just middle America. You know, how much exposure are they getting to Hamilton or whatever, or Sweat?
Yeah, we don't, you know, and that's part of the problem. We expect, you know, we think that we're telling our stories, but most people don't have access to them. And so you actually have to go. You have to go to these places and seek the audiences out and seek out the people that need to hear these stories. And it's powerful. You see change happening right before your eyes.
Yeah. Thank you. Minerva, I think this question might be for you mostly. Is the local press and journalists responsibly reporting on cases assigned to police for their investigation? For example, in the murder of Lilia Esperanza Ocapina, I remember protesting in front of Southampton Town Hall with Minerva in 2015.
The beginning part of the question, what is that again?
Is the local press and journalists responsibly reporting on cases assigned to police for further investigation, for example? Sorry, it was a little hard to read.
No, okay, I get it, yeah. I think the role of journalism out here, and we're kind of lucky to have some pretty good, really good journalists out here, and some papers that have taken on some hard topics and they've jumped right into the center of things. I think oftentimes with some of the community members that we're working with, there are going to be folks that are not that can't be at that moment as open to share some of the stories that they're living because they do not feel safe, they do not feel comfortable to do that. So unfortunately, the work of a journalist to kind of expose some things sometimes, and I think Carlos can speak to this as well because we often speak about this, it kind of shortcuts that when we really do need to hear about more of what's happening, some lives that people are leading, how are they dealing with a situation that happened with Lilia Esperanza, and what the role and how far in or not is a journalist allowed into some of these stories. I think in terms of, if part of the question also has to do with what else has happened to make sure that that was investigated fully. When a case like that happens, or other things that are happening out here, that OLA can be either involved with working with law enforcement, foiling for information, studying that information. We now have a human rights attorney who's working with us as well. We work with other organizations, including Jose Perez over at Latino Justice, and many other organizations, in terms of being able to dig down into things that have happened to make sure that justice is there. We're very much involved in that, and we were involved in kind of digging a bit further into what happened with that particular case, and it's a pretty hard one. But I think journalists out here, to answer one part of the question, I think they are wanting very much to be at the center of some of these stories. I think it's this balance between, is there going to be the subject of that story, are they going to be open enough and feel that they truly can speak about the thing fully that they're experiencing, because that's still not, we're not really at a place where that can happen too easily. But OLA, as an advocacy organization, being independent, most of our money is private, and therefore we truly need support to maintain that independence. We need to be able to have those conversations, those hard conversations, and ask for those foils and study them and understand what's going on at the policy level for the protection and the safety of all of us here. So we're actively involved in that pursuit as well.
I'm kind of getting the shepherd's crook here to like wind it up, but you know, part of the impetus for this panel, when Minerva was describing it to me, was to make sure that we talked about how art and theater and the kinds of things that the people on this stage do can have a positive effect on the immigration crisis and the members of our community and bring us all together. But there are two remaining questions that I just want to, I don't think we're going to be able to wrap this up by answering them, but I just want to read them because it shows that there are people that want hard and practical solutions to the devastating problems that are facing us. One being what can be done nationally to stop ICE deportation. And the second, how devastating will the president's new immigration policy regarding receiving food stamps and social services to our East End immigrant population? I mean, we have to all absolutely support OLA and all the important work that Minerva's been doing and all the important contacts that she's made with legislators and police forces out here, I mean, all over our East End community. It's really critical that OLA receives our support, continued support. I'm not sure that we can tackle this at this point, and it is kind of the end of this, but I want to thank whoever wrote those questions, and certainly this has been very, very stimulating. Thank you so much to our panelists. Do you want to?
Thank you, April. I just, like you said, I want to encourage anyone and everyone, whether you wrote a question or not, to check out the OLA Facebook page, find us, call me, Sandra and I would be happy to speak to you about ways that we're involved in changing and strengthening our communities out here. Some of that touches at a state level, some of it touches potentially at a national level, but a lot of our focus is really what's happening here locally. Whether you come out here on the weekends or in the summer, or whether you live here year-round, or you just moved out here, that there's great work to be done and be able to touch in and connect with it in a variety of ways that you might be more comfortable with. But I have to say that if you're coming out here in any capacity, and you really should be involved in the work that OLA's doing or know more about it. So Sandra and I would be thrilled to talk to you more about that And so I wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, so
thank you for being here.
Thank you
right
so
now.
much to Minerva and Carlo, Sandra, Carlos, and also thank you so much to Guildhall and Tracy Marshall for helping to organize this. And thank you all very much for
and
coming.
the panel, thank you very much.